All right, thank you so much. For those of you who are still eager to put things in the raffles, you can do that after this because they're not going to be picked till supper time. So, paradox. I think I'd like to start by inviting you all to get into groups of, say, 3, 4, 5 people. Some of you are off by yourselves, and maybe you'd rather just be in a group of 2, but I think it'd be better if you could connect with some other people, because this conference is about connecting. And part of what I'm going to be talking about today is being separate from other people, but if you could just connect with at least one other person near you, and maybe a few, and I'll give you a minute or 2 to introduce yourselves. Make sure you can look. You can't read my name tag from here, but it says John Odhner. So you can read the name tags of the people next to you if you don't already know them, and just take a moment to introduce yourselves and say something that you've enjoyed so far about this conference. So I'll give you a couple minutes for that. If you're in a group of more than 4 people, keep your comments short, because I'm not giving you a whole lot of time. All right. Thank you. Thank you for beginning to connect with each other. You know, if I had the chance, I would love to sit down with each one of you and have a long conversation and hear your stories. It would be so delightful. And we have to move along if we're going to get through what I promised here. So I want to talk about this scale that all of us are on in some ways, and one end of the scale is being together with other people. And you've just had a couple minutes to be together with other people. It's something that a lot of people find themselves not so, well, the other end of the scale is being separate from other people. And sometimes people find themselves on one end of this scale, and they really long to be at the other end. They want to be together with other people. And they feel badly that they are separate. Or sometimes they're together with other people and they really want to get away from the people that they're with. And sometimes that happens in marriage or lack of marriage. Sometimes it happens in lots of other kinds of situations. Work situations, people whose houses are next to each other and they wish they weren't. So lots of situations. And at the same time, I want to look a little bit more at what it means to be together with people. Going to need the microphone, because I want you all, raise your hand, bring the microphone to you. What's great about being together with other people? Who can give me an answer? Yeah, raise your hand high until Levi has a chance to bring you the mic.
So just a moment ago, Pete Mergen, who attended my talk this morning about AI, asked me, so, what's the takeaway? And this was a great question, because I wasn't sure off the bat, but getting to share my ideas and see what stuck, what didn't make sense, helps me get a better understanding. And so to sum up, the takeaway from my talk was that active listening makes you smarter.
Thank you. And this might be the advantage of being together with your partner, but it might be other people as well. So go ahead.
I just heard Zach say that you learn things, and that's interesting because my thought was then you have if you're with people, you have someone to love.
Thank you.
Remember what I was going to say. Do I have to touch anything? I feel like being together with other people, especially this particular circumstance today, gets me out of myself. It gets me out of the thoughts I can have about being unhappy, discouraged, disappointed, all kinds of terrible things. And it puts me in a really good mood to be talking with all kinds of other people. And we're all in this together. And that is a wonderful thing.
Thank you. Do you have any other comments about what's great about being together with other people? All right. So let's go on and talk a little bit about what's great. Well, you know, sometimes you want to be at the other end of the scale. You want to be separate from other people. Why would people want to be separate? Why would they want to not be with other people or maybe with some specific other person? Right behind you. There.
I think hello? Okay. I think alone time is important for all humans. The Lord calls us to look inward, examine ourselves, and I think that that can only be accomplished. I shouldn't say only. It can best be accomplished, I think, in alone time, and then hopefully then practiced together when we're together. Just one possible opinion.
Thank you. Anyone else?
And also being separate to recharge yourself.
Time to recharge yourself. Yes. Is that it for being separate from other people? Maybe it's not so great as I was making it out to be.
I'm going to mostly echo what previous people have said, but being able to work on yourself separate from other people and do that so that you can be together with other people better.
All right. Thank you. That's great. So we have these two ends of the scale, and we have a pretty good idea of what they involve. And what I want to do is look at a different scale. Not about being separate or together, which we all find ourselves on different places of that at different times with different people. But I'm looking at a different dimension now, and that's when we're with people, is it healthy or unhealthy? What is the nature of that relationship? So I'm suggesting that when we're talking about being separate from other people, there are two different ways. We can be separate from other people in an unhealthy way, or we can be separate from people in a healthy way. So, an unhealthy way is what hit the wrong button there. An unhealthy way is what I'm calling isolation. There. And a healthy way is autonomy. And so that probably makes sense. Does that? Well, we'll talk more about isolation and autonomy, but if you're isolated from people, that can have a lot of negative consequences. Or it can be coming from, you just hate people. You don't want to be with them. It's not what we're created for. But it is good to have autonomy, to be independent, and be your own person. And so we'll go on. Being together with other people can also be healthy or unhealthy. And if it's unhealthy, I'm calling it enmeshment. And you could call it other things. That's a word I'm using. When your life is tied up with someone else's life in such a way that you're hurting each other or damaging each other or causing each other pain, that is not a healthy way to be together with other people. But when there isn't that pain, when you can be together in a way that lets you love others and communicate with them and share with them, work with them and play with them, that's what I'm calling intimacy. And I don't mean sexual intimacy, although that's a part of it in marriage, but just being very close to each other and open with each other. So, a little closer look at autonomy. I have this picture that probably most of you recognize of God creating, Da Vinci's picture of God creating Adam, and that hand of God reaching but not quite touching the hand of Adam. I have these words to describe autonomy: freedom, choosing your own path in life; independence, having your own thoughts, having your own goals, working on your own projects; enjoying solitude, being able to say no. Is there anything that anyone would like to add to that list? Yes?
Being free of overbearing influence of others.
That's great. Thank you. And for those who couldn't hear because their microphone wasn't there, being free of overbearing influence of others. All right, let's go on and talk about isolation. What is isolation about? And here I have two hands again, and obviously not connecting with anyone else. So isolation involves loneliness and boredom and fear of intimacy or commitment in relationships, misunderstanding, poor communication, escape. Sometimes you want to be separate from people because you want to get away from bad things, or you just want to escape from the situation you're in, but isolation isn't always a great thing. Denial, being out of touch with yourself and others, being unable to ask for help. Anything that anyone wants to add to that list? The microphone is on its way.
What comes to mind is that maybe you've been shunned for some reason. Some cultures shun people.
Yep. And obviously, this, come on back, this guy in jail is being shunned, maybe for good reason, maybe not for good reason. I'm not going to judge. But go ahead.
So I was thinking about germs. When you're around people, you can get germs. But if you're not around people, what are you missing? I mean, what do you get? What I meant was, are there good germs?
And there are good germs. Without good germs, we wouldn't be able to digest our food. You need that. There's good germs on your skin that protect you from bad germs.
I'm not sure if this is a form of isolation or a result of it, but addictions can come from it as you're all alone and you just indulge in whatever.
Right. Big part of addiction is isolation that goes along with it or leads to it. All right, let's go on and talk about intimacy. Being connected and sharing, honesty, communicating, expressing feelings, sharing dreams and goals, working together, playing together, growing together, learning from each other. Anyone wants to add to that list?
Somewhat implied with mutual support.
Mutual support. Thank you. One of the reasons I'm inviting you to speak into the microphone is this session is being recorded, and people will be able to listen to it online, all of it except for when you're having your small discussions and when you're not using the mic. The latter of which they might want to listen to, and so we'll try to make sure you get the mic when it's needed. So intimacy is a good thing. Lots of good things in being together with other people in a healthy way. But being together with people in an unhealthy way is not so pleasant, because sometimes you're connected with people that you'd like to get away from that might do you harm. So, what happens with enmeshment? Blame, shame, guilt, conflict, anger, abuse. Those are things that thrive in situations where you're together with other people. How often are you going to have conflict or abuse if there's nobody else around? Well, you can abuse yourself. But we'll not go there right now. Accepting responsibility for someone else's choices. Any of you ever done that? Accepted responsibility for someone else's choices? Maybe not. Wanting others to change so that you can be happy. See, that's not necessarily, well, what? Yeah. If only you would do this, then I wouldn't be in such misery. And that kind of thing comes up in marriage and lots of other relationships. Being someone you are not to please others. So, some of these things are really bad things to do, like abusing other people. But some of them are bad in a much more subtle way, much less intentional way. And finally, the last three, resentment and resentment and resentment. One of the big marks of enmeshment is you might do lots of good for the person you're enmeshed with, and you resent it. You resent that they don't appreciate the good you do. Anyway. All right. So anything that anyone wants to add to this list?
Just as I'm looking at this list and the other one, the term authenticity comes to mind. Like, it's important for people to want to feel that they're authentic, that they can be authentic with other people. And when you're in enmeshment, you're in conflict with that. You feel you can't be authentic with others.
Thank you. That's a great word, great comment. Okay.
May I add?
Yeah.
Something that is sort of coming up for me with the distinction between intimacy and enmeshment is resilience. In an enmeshed relationship, there's no resilience to any errors. Those errors are, tend to get reflected back and propagate continuously. Whereas when you have that a healthy, intimate relationship, I can share my pain, something I'm going through, and not have it reflected back, but have healthy, autonomy reflected back, and that can actually provide healing and break that cycle. So this, I guess, kind of goes back to intimacy, but I didn't see it until the contrast with enmeshment. Resilience is a big one for me.
That's right. And resilience is tied in with forgiveness and repentance and the possibility of change. So that's good. All right. Let's see. So this is just sort of a summary. We have this scale, or at one end you can be together with other people, at the other end you're separate, but this other dimension of whether it's unhealthy or healthy gives us 4 different quadrants. And you can be autonomous, you can be isolated, you can be intimate or connected, and you can be enmeshed. And so the question I have for you on these 2 different scales, these 4 different quadrants, where are you? Or where have you been? Or where are you headed? And I'd like you to get back into your groups and talk with each other a little bit about that. Go ahead. Levi, if you could grab that microphone, I'd like to find out if the conversations you've just had have led to reflections you want to share with the whole group. Does anyone have a thought that came out of your discussion or otherwise? Okay.
Our discussion said we agreed that sometimes you go back and forth, right? Separate, together, healthy, unhealthy in a date. So it's kind of like a battle, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you have a common ground, like marriage group, right? Then you associate with that common ground, right? And then also, if you're single, you're looking for also a single group or other, no? Like when you got support for alcoholism, AA, right? So then try to help each other.
Thank you. Yes, we move around on this map quite a lot, don't we?
I think the quadrants that you set up are a very useful tool, just a visual tool to help us think about, ask ourselves the question you ask us, where are we? And to be able to understand and acknowledge that there are both healthy and unhealthy ways to be together and to be separate that we might not think of. It might be useful in our own introspection about our life and how we might make things better for ourselves and for those who we love.
Thank you. That's so true.
We were talking a little bit about how even within sort of a healthy togetherness relationship, you can have more and different levels of intimacy in that you can be just acquaintances with somebody, and that's not unhealthy, but it's not as deep and understanding as some other relationships.
Right. And that's important. It's not either healthy or unhealthy. So there's lots of different levels of intensity on the healthy side and lots of different levels of intensity on the unhealthy side. And yes. Oh, okay, good. Let's go on. I want to talk a little bit about boundaries. And I'm going to go back a few thousand years to Deuteronomy chapter 19. You shall not remove your neighbor's landmark. We still do this today sometimes. Put up a stone or a pillar to say, this is where our territory begins, or our territory ends and your territory begins. This is, and in Genesis, Laban and Jacob have had a conflict. They've been living together for 20 years, and he married his daughters and had his grandchildren, and now they're so disconnected and angry with each other that Jacob has picked up and left, and Laban comes after him, and they finally agree to disagree and make a promise that they will not do each other harm in the future. And Laban says, here is this heap, and here is this pillar, which I've placed between you and me. This heap is a witness. This pillar is a witness that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap to me for harm. Don't know what happened to my last word there. I'm wondering, Levi, if there's someone here who would be willing to read this passage from Secrets of Heaven for me, explaining this.
In ancient times, such heaps were for a sign or for witness, and afterwards were also for worship. Here, for a sign and for a witness, for a sign that the boundary was there, and for a witness that a covenant was made there, and that neither of them should pass it to do evil to the other.
And in another passage, someone else wants a turn.
In the very earliest times, stones were set up along the borders between the different nations' clans to keep them from crossing over to do each other evil. And this is what Laban and Jacob did in Genesis 31:52. The ban on crossing over these stones to do evil was a law of the nations among them.
And you want to pass that along and give, I think I saw a hand up over here.
These stones stood on the borders so the earliest people, who habitually saw in every object on earth a corresponding spiritual or heavenly quality, would look at the stones as borders and think about truth on the outermost level of the divine design.
Whoa. Truth on the outermost level. I want to make that a little bit simpler. Truth on the outermost level of the Lord's order is like the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments, having been written on stones, I think, I'll get to some pictures of stones in a little bit later. But the Ten Commandments, having been written on stones, were boundaries between people. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, his property. That's very closely related to don't move your neighbor's landmark and say, oh, I'm going to say my land extends over onto your land. I'm going to appropriate it to myself. Don't kill your neighbor. Don't lie to your neighbor. Don't steal from your neighbor. So much of this is, these are the boundaries between people. This is as far as you can go in a relationship. Don't go any farther. So, those stones of the Ten Commandments, they would look at those boundary stones and think of the Ten Commandments. Of course, the Ten Commandments hadn't been given in that form in Jacob's time. That came later with Moses. But they still had those kinds of rules. So I'm thinking about Robert Frost's poem about building fences, where his neighbor says, good fences make good neighbors, and Robert Frost has his doubts. Before I build a wall, I'd ask to know, what was I walling in or walling out? And to whom was I like to give offense? Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. One of the questions he had in his mind for his neighbor was, why are we building this wall here when you have pine trees on one side and I have apple trees on my side, and my apple trees are not going to sneak into your pine forest and eat up all your pine cones? What am I walling in or walling out? Was his question. So there's this tendency to have boundaries between people, but then sometimes we make too much of the boundary. And I want to talk about walking at another time. I meant to move that slide. But anyway, here's a boundary marker set up someplace in England, the top one there. And this is interesting to me because it's a pillar, but it's also a heap of stones holding up that pillar, which reminds me of Jacob putting up a pillar and a heap. So this one up in the upper right corner is actually a boundary marker between the United States and Canada. And that's a heap of stones. But, nope. Yeah. There's other boundary markers from various places in the world. And now I want to... The thing about a boundary marker is it's just a marker. And they had this rule, don't pass by the marker to do evil. Don't move your neighbor's landmark. But you could just walk by. There's nothing stopping you, which is much different from barriers. And here we have an artist's conception of the city of Jericho. Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. It's a picture sometimes of our relationships or how we are in our relationships, where we build these barriers between us and other people. And instead of having just a clear boundary that's marked, we have these walls that are built that keep people out, keep people in. The Great Wall of China is a beautiful illustration of that kind of barrier that's raised up because there's enemies on the other side. And these walls are partly there to keep them from killing each other. We also have walls in the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the walls in the concentration camps that keep people in. People aren't able to cross out. Some of these walls to keep people out and some to keep people in. barriers are a different thing. So, in our scheme here, where we have autonomy is a matter of having clear boundaries. But isolation is having huge barriers. And sometimes we turn boundaries into barriers, especially when we've been hurt. And we want to protect ourselves. We want to protect other people. And sometimes we do it unintentionally because we become defensive and protective of maybe things where we need to be vulnerable instead. Intimacy is only possible when there's no barriers there. So when bad things are going on, we might need to erect barriers. We might need to put up walls, but it stops the possibility of intimacy. Whereas with enmeshment, there's no boundaries. And people's lives, they impinge on each other's lives and hurt each other because nothing is stopping them. So, yeah. Just let's see if there's any thoughts on that. That's either takes a lot of reflection or it just is so obvious that you don't need to comment.
On the clear boundaries, it's like having a clear goal, a direction. It keeps you on the right path most of the time.
Thank you.
The phrase that keeps coming to my mind is, if you give an inch, someone will take a mile. So if there's no boundaries, it's easy for people to take advantage of a relationship or a friendship or your neighbors. You know, we have no fence, so it's hard to keep our neighbors' dogs out doing their business on our lawn, you know? Yeah. And I'm friendly with them, but, you know, they do take advantage, so. But
right.
It's important to set boundaries many times, I think.
What I was puzzling about is the intimacy and no barriers. I feel like there can be some barriers. Maybe it makes the intimacy not so intimate, but I don't think it prevents intimacy if there are some barriers, but maybe there are boundaries?
Well, that's what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
And it may it may be a matter of vocabulary here. Yeah, semantics. So I'm not suggesting that intimacy doesn't have boundaries. Okay. In fact, you need to have boundaries, and that's part of the point here, which I will get to next. So that's a good segue, but...
I don't know if it fits in commenting on the whole chart here, but I like your reference to the Jacob and Laban story because one of the, just before the part you're quoting, Laban calls it Mizpah. And there's a Mizpah charm that people have, or a Mizpah coin, which is broken in two, and each party takes a coin as sort of a friendship charm. So it sounds like these guys are sort of agreeing to disagree and we'll go our separate ways and we won't interfere with each other, but people have taken it as once we've got this clear boundary, now we can be friends.
Yeah. And that reminds me of Jonathan and David's separation, where they say, "The Lord be between you and me," going forward. And it's kind of the same thing, that being separate and yet having that connection. All right. So, let's see. We've got autonomy and isolation. And one of the things I notice about that is they can look a lot alike. So I knew a guy who liked to come home from work and go out in his garage and work on his model airplanes. Was that healthy or not healthy? I mean, he had a wife and he had kids. Should he go in his garage and work on his model airplanes when he's got family?
I think it depends on what else he's doing in his life at other times.
Yeah, it could be autonomy and it could be isolation. What's he trying to get away from? I don't know.
There's a good time to be isolated and there's a bad time. Like, I'm a musician, I like to play, and she most definitely has no problem with me playing guitar and when I want to. But if I'm supposed to be doing laundry or doing something else, then that isolation isn't benefiting anybody. It's not benefiting me because it's putting a strain on my relationship. If I'm choosing my autonomy or isolation or whatever you have over the collective, that they need me to chip in. So there's a good time for me to be isolated, and there's a bad time to be isolated.
Right.
So you just got to pick your battles.
Yeah, and even with the music, the whole point of music is to connect with other people emotionally, but you don't want to inflict your practicing on them. So.
One of the questions I would have about that model airplane time, that garage time, is, does that space respect the boundaries of his responsibilities in the home, or does it try to expand? Is he escaping to the garage so often that he's ignoring his other responsibilities? And so that boundary can kind of shift, even invisibly. It can move and eat up more time or act more like an escape. And those invisible shifts are often, like you say, they can look the same but be opposite. So it's just interesting to notice, that boundary and how that action of going into the garage can be either a boundary that he sets for his own health or a barrier that he sets in defense of whatever problems there are in the home. But
Yep. So we have a similar thing with enmeshment and intimacy. They can look a lot alike. Sometimes you have married couples and you think, oh, what a lovely couple. They spend all their time together. They're so connected, and you don't know what's going on in their relationship. Maybe they actually hate each other's guts. And yet they're so enmeshed, they're so involved in making it look like everything's okay that you don't see what's going on. So any reflections on, two people, they go off together and they make love. Is that healthy or unhealthy? It depends. It depends. Because the difference between enmeshment and intimacy is not about how it appears. It's about what's going on inside. And in general, between healthy and unhealthy, it starts with what's going on inside of you. So, a little bit more about autonomy and intimacy. These two or it's just the other way around. They look like opposite things, but they're really the same. And this is a really important part of this whole idea. Autonomy and intimacy look opposite, but they are the same. You can't have intimacy without autonomy. If you have intimacy without autonomy, it's actually just enmeshment. It's not intimacy at all. You're not connecting with that other person. You're connecting with your illusion of who that person is, or who they're pretending to be, or who they're forced to be. But there's no intimacy there. It's just an outside connection. To have true intimacy, you have to have that person be their own person. Only in that way can you love that person for who they are. And we have a hand over here.
Thank you. There's an important passage in Conjugal Love that speaks to this. Not obviously, but it's there. It says, this is Conjugal Love 200. It says, as the husband becomes more and more a husband, the wife becomes more and more a wife. So she's becoming more a wife, more getting into her essence, and he's becoming more and more a husband, getting into his essence. So they're becoming more different in terms of their masculinity and femininity, and yet it's intimacy.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's excellent, Ray. And I don't have that quote here, but I have another one that's related to it, and it's about something deeper than that, which is how we relate to the Lord. And who's got the mic now? Oh, yeah. So would you be willing to read this passage for me? And then make your comment.
The more closely we are united to the Lord, the more clearly we seem to have our own identity. And yet the more obvious it is to us that we belong to the Lord.
Thank you. And did you want to make a comment in addition?
That was about the two things. The word usefulness seems to come in there somewhere.
Ah, yes. All right. Okay. This is about intimacy and autonomy between us and the Lord. The more closely we are united to the Lord, the more clearly we seem to have our own identity. The more independent we feel. The more actually dependent we are on the Lord, the more we feel independent. And that is at the core of all the paradoxes I'm talking about today. And it's at the core of the one that Ray just mentioned, that husband and wife will feel each more, a wife will feel more and more a wife, and the husband more and more a husband as they come closer to each other. And it is a paradox that as a husband becomes more and more a husband, more and more masculine, he does that in part by receiving his wife's feminine qualities and characteristics, by becoming softer and more gentle and more loving, and all the more perceptive, all the things that she has that he doesn't have, he acquires from her. And in that process, even though he's becoming more like her, he's also becoming more of a husband, more of a masculine person, more himself. And the same thing is true for the wife, as she acquires wisdom from her husband, and as she becomes more like him, as that becomes part of her core being, she receives an image of him into herself. They both do that for the other. Becomes more like him, but at the same time becomes more feminine, more a wife, more her own being. So, we want to go on. What is true for autonomy and intimacy is true for love and wisdom, or being and expression. If we want to become philosophical, we can talk about esse and existere in Latin, or substance and form. Love is being and wisdom, its expression, for love does not exist except in a state of wisdom, and wisdom does not exist except as a result of love. Consequently, when love is in a state of wisdom, then it has expression. So this is talking about how you can't have love without wisdom, you can't have wisdom without love. And these two have a relationship between them, which is like substance and form. These two are in a relationship so formed that they can indeed be distinguished in thought, but not in fact. They can be distinguished in thought, but not in operation. It's translated elsewhere. We can think of them as two separate things, but they don't exist as two separate things. And to illustrate that, I want to talk more about substance and form. Here I have a bunch of cubes. Each one's made of a different kind of metal. So each one is made of a different substance, but they all have the same form, or similar forms. The color is part of the form, and the hardness and softness is part of the form. And they're not all the same in that regard. But in our thought, we can think substance is one thing, and the form is something else. And we can take a substance and change its form. And we can think of a form and take a different substance and copy that form. So we can separate them in thought, but not in operation. And this is true of many things in life that they need, but it's especially true of this autonomy and intimacy. You can think of autonomy and intimacy as two different things, but they don't exist separate from each other. They have to be together. One without the other isn't what it is. Intimacy without autonomy, as I said before, it's just enmeshment. And enmeshment and autonomy without intimacy is just isolation. It's not the real thing. So substance and form can be separated, and we can go on and talk about isolation and enmeshment. They also look the same. I mean, they look different, but they are actually the same. You can be so enmeshed with a person, you can spend your whole day thinking about that other person. And every minute of your day is, what is that person doing? What are they thinking? My thoughts are consumed with that other person, and yet I have no communication with them. I feel completely isolated and alone because we're not talking to each other. And it's just in my imagination that I have a connection with them. And being, connected with external things in life and mutual pain and suffering. So, we put all these things together, and we have these two different scales I mentioned before. This horizontal scale is the apparent issue, and the vertical one is the real issue. And so often in our discussions, we get caught up with arguing about the apparent issue. Should we get a divorce or not? Should we get married or not? Where should we be on this horizontal scale? And we don't get to the real issues. So, that's what I call, that isolation wasn't supposed to be there. Oh, no, it is. I put all these other things in here. A paradox box. A parabox. So, these are paraboxes. And there's a parabox. If you squint your eyes, maybe that reads as parabox. And if you turn it upside down, if I turn this upside down, no, that doesn't do anything for you guys. Yeah, see, maybe it says parabox now. And which way is it right side up on the right or the left? Yes, okay. So, want to go on? Well, no, before we talk about this, any thoughts on this whole map? I'm going to talk more, but...
Speaking of paradoxes, there's a paradox that I've thought about for many years, and that is the one that the Lord says that we cannot be regenerated unless we feel our life as if it's our own. Yet it isn't, and we need to acknowledge that. Sometimes in my more cynical days or days of resisting what the Lord wants for me, I look at that as He's asking us to live a lie or a contradiction. Anyway, that's what comes up to mind when we're talking about these paradoxes. I'm kind of inclined to describe that particular one as the ultimate paradox of human existence. And I'm so happy that Stephen Cole used that words, I think twice in his sermon 2 weeks ago. It's the first time I've heard a new church minister in my memory use that term to describe that situation, and you use it all day today. So thank you for that. And I may need more guidance on my own view of that ultimate paradox someday.
Yep. And no.
So this is.
This is
a
that
marriage.
ultimate paradox you were talking about is also involved in this idea. Go ahead, Jill.
So this is a marriage conference, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And could you kind of maybe make that point you're trying to make a little clear between you can't have a good marriage unless you are together. What are you trying to say exactly?
In a good marriage, husband and wife need to be connected, open, honest, sharing their thoughts and feelings, having similarities. The more similarities they have, the more closely they can be united. So that connection, that intimacy is what marriage is all about. And at the same time, they need to have, each of them have freedom and independence. They need to, one passage describes marriage as a genuine marriage is when each of the partners loves to think and will the way the other one does. I love to think the way you do. I love to have the values that you have. And then the other partner, same thing. So they want what each other has, and they will what each other wills. But you can't love what your partner wills if your partner doesn't have choices and a will, and if you don't know who your partner is. Your partner has to have that distinct identity in order to be together. So, I want to illustrate that with a couple of other things. We sometimes compare marriage to heart and lungs. Heart and lungs, you can feel maybe feel your pulse, feel your heart beating in your own chest. You can be conscious of your own breathing. And your heart and your lungs are the two organs in your body that make your body live. Without getting into the brain for now. But for your body as a whole, having the blood go through the lungs, go out to the body, is how every cell in your body stays alive. And the heart does that by pumping. And the lungs breathe and does its... And these two things are moving together, and there's a membrane, the pleura, between them that allows them to each move independently and do their job separately from the other. And if they didn't have that independence, they didn't have that boundary of the pleura between them, they could not function. And if you get pleurisy and that pleura gets irritated, then it's very painful because there's friction between the heart and the lungs and their motion. And it's a really big problem. So in that relationship, the heart and the lungs are kept distinct from each other and separate, each able to do its own function, and yet they are intimately connected. And the heart sends its arteries into the lungs, pulmonary arteries, where they pick up oxygen. The blood picks up oxygen and then goes back into the heart. And that connection is so intimate that blood vessels from the heart surround every little tiny pocket of air in the lungs. And there's no place in the lungs where that, the trachea goes down into your bronchia and then into the lobes of your lungs and breaks up into these little sacs of air that fill your lungs, and the air goes into those sacs. And there's membranes that the blood goes through the membrane of the capillary and the membrane of the lungs. No, the blood doesn't go through. The oxygen goes through into the blood, and the carbon dioxide comes out from the blood into the lungs. But there's kept separate. There's no place where the blood can cross that boundary into the lungs. Because if it does, you start coughing up blood and you're going to die. And there's no place where the air crosses that boundary into the blood, because if it did, you'd get bubbles in your blood and you'd have a heart attack or stroke and you could die. So keeping them distinct, keeping each one in its place, the blood in the vessels from the heart and the air in the sacs in the lungs, is something where even with that very close intertwining connection of the vessels with the air sacs, there's still a distinction between them. And each one, the heart and the lungs, does its own function, but in the context of the body, they're always working together. The heart could not do its job without the lungs. Just couldn't. And the lungs could not do its job without the heart. It couldn't. So you were mentioning before, use. In the use, they're joined together. When we talked about two things, substance and form, being separate in thought but not in action, that's the same thing. The heart and lungs can be separate in thought but not in action. And the same thing is true of husband and wife. Husband and wife need that kind of intimacy that's working together like the heart and lungs. And if you want an illustration of that, come to this morning's plenary session and see how Robin and Graham were working together. Or maybe you got to Ray and Starr's session or some other session and got an illustration of heart and lungs beating and breathing and working together on a single usefulness. I don't know. Did that answer your question at all?
You know, over the years, I've thought about what does it really look like for, in a marriage couple, having one flesh and one mind. And I think you've brought some good language around that, so you can describe that and talk about it with your partner. I think that you really enlightened that concept for me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Want to go on because we talked about enmeshment and isolation. Want to ask, how do you get away from that? This is, anybody recognize this? Alcatraz. Hard to get away from Alcatraz. And it was famous for being difficult to escape from. How do you get away from isolation? How do you get away from enmeshment? And we might need the microphone for this.
It struck me earlier when you were talking about them that one of the key differences is the unhealthy one is self-serving or attempting to be self-serving, and that the healthy one is looking outward. So I would say acting outward or looking outward would get you out of them, I hope.
Something I have come to appreciate about paradoxes is that while we often think of paradoxes as these like breakdowns in logic, and logical reasoning is practically always founded on some sort of axiom, some sort of here's something we decide is true and then we see what follows. But paradoxes, I think, really can capture something that goes beyond logic, which is free will. And logic can't encapsulate free will because free will defies the axioms. It says, no, you actually get to choose what that starting point is. So I just appreciate this idea of getting to, and like you called our attention to the plenary this morning, everyone assumes they're right, but it's when you decide to see things from someone else's perspective, when you decide to try it a different way, love what the other loves, that's really when you are free. Because now that you see, there's more than one path to get where I want, all of a sudden you're not locked into a single, this is the only route, this is the right way. You see there are an infinite, potentially come to realize there's an infinite number of paths that can work out. And yeah, just the willingness to see from another perspective, paradoxically, can break down those axioms and defy all logic to create something really miraculous. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we have this goal sometimes of we want to get away from isolation towards intimacy, and we end up on an actual path that takes us towards enmeshment instead. Someone who is so lonely that they want to find someone to love. And they go looking for someone to love, and instead of finding someone to love, they find someone to hook up with. And they get enmeshed. And it's not what they thought it was going to be. Anyone ever identify with that kind of thing?
I mean the opposite way. I went from enmeshment to isolation.
You're feeling enmeshed, and you want to get some freedom and independence and autonomy, and instead you end up just being isolated. That often happens. So one of the things that can help is when we're trying to get away from isolation or enmeshment, that we recognize that isolation and enmeshment go together. So if you want to get away from enmeshment, at the same time, you have to work on not isolating. So that means what is essentially going to happen is instead of moving horizontally, you're going to move vertically. And this goes back to, the fundamental concept of you can't have love by itself or wisdom by itself, because autonomy is a matter of wisdom and intimacy is a matter of love. And when the two are together, then you can be raised up to a spiritual level. But separately, love without wisdom is merely natural love. And wisdom without love is merely natural wisdom. It's not true wisdom. Or another way the writings put it is, truth that's not united to good is apparent truth, not genuine truth. And good that's not united to truth is apparent goodness, not genuine goodness. So how do we change? How do we go from things not working to things working? I've listed a few things here. Start changing on the inside. Embrace both sides. That is, look for autonomy and intimacy at the same time. Try to get away from enmeshment and isolation at the same time. Work on a spiritual program. A spiritual spiritual growth program of some sort, or a 12-step or whatever. Get into a support group. Lori and I are a big fan of marriage groups, but lots of other kinds of support groups we've been parts of, and they're helpful too. Make choices in a way that autonomy and intimacy, the autonomy is about freedom to make your own choice. And intimacy is about connection, which involves a commitment. And those seem like opposite things. Commitment is, to someone who doesn't want commitment, it's the opposite of freedom. It's being trapped and bound. But real love is about a commitment that's free. And it's not a commitment if the freedom isn't there. But it's also not freedom if the commitment isn't there. Because you're not free to love without commitment. So making choices, clarifying your boundaries, getting clear. This is my choice, that's your choice. And I don't have time to go into it today, but some of you are familiar with Mark Carlson's 5 micro-boundaries, where he talks about, this crossing the landmark into your neighbor's territory. Never cross it to do harm. Well, anytime you become aware of or connected with someone's thoughts and feelings, with their beliefs or intentions, anything going on inside their head, you're on their property. You've crossed a boundary, and they've maybe allowed you to see who they are and what they care about. But you have to be so careful not to cross that boundary to do harm, and not to make judgments or criticisms, or feel like you have to manage or fix anything inside that person. There's a Old Testament law that, when you're going to retrieve something that someone's borrowed from you, you don't go inside their house and take it, but you wait outside and let them bring it to you. That's a matter of respecting someone else's mind and how they think, not trying to control their thoughts and feelings inside their head. So, clarifying your boundaries, you can read more about that in New Church Life or in the past, or look it up in New Church Audio. But the micro boundaries are important. And keep at it. It takes time. It's a lifetime process. So patience is really important. And anything that anyone wants to add to this list? How do we change from an unhealthy relationship to a healthy one? And Levi's right there if you have a thought.
A couple years ago, I had a therapist that forced me to say, I deserve to be loved by myself and others. So it made me say every day. I didn't believe it at first, but I always had to say it every single day. And I was always sick of saying it. Until, months and months later, I accepted what the message was, is that I can't learn to love anybody else if I can't love myself first. So I think that's how you change.
All right. Oh, go ahead.
Pray and read the word.
Couple of good things.
I don't know if it's directly on point, but obviously, if you're on the left side, you're dealing with yourself. On the other side, you're dealing with other people, and like I say, maybe it's a no-brainer, maybe it's obvious that if you're down in the entanglements, one attitude you might be, I need to get away from these people. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's, I need to change my relationship with these people, right? I mean, you could look at it either way. If there's other people and you're entangled, is the problem the people, or is it the relationship with these people?
Yep, thank you. And that's kind of the whole point. Because if you think it's the people, then you're just going to move over from entanglement to isolation. And if you realize it's something inside of you, that's when you can raise your level.
I don't know if you have a comment about men and women's roles in this business. Are they the same or different?
Oh, well, I did comment on that. I talked about the heart and the lungs. And the heart and lungs are different roles. And you can think of that in terms, I could go on for longer than I've gone already about the heart and lungs, but I'm not going to do more than that today. I do want to mention that there are other paradoxes. So when your partner says, "How do I look?" What do you say? Are you going to answer honestly, or are you going to say the kind thing? Who's for honesty? Who's for kindness? Who raised their hands both times? Okay. And not to belabor it, but this is, we can be honest, we can be kind. It can be criticism or flattery. And honesty and kindness are actually the same thing. You can't have kindness without honesty. If you have kindness without honesty, it's just flattery. It's not real kindness. If you have criticism, if you have honesty without kindness, it's not honesty, actually. It's just criticism. And that's way different from... See, the thing about criticism is it's a lie. So often it's a lie. Because criticism is when we say, well, you're the problem. And so often, I'm the problem. If I'm upset by something, the problem is in me. And there's times when we have to make judgments about other people. There's times when we have to be honest, and it's going to look like criticism, but it's actually a kindness. And you can't separate honesty from kindness. If the kindness isn't there, it's not honesty. Not really, honestly speaking. So we can say the same thing. Honesty and criticism look alike, that kindness and flattery can look a lot alike, but they're opposite. And that I shouldn't have had these things come on one at a time separately, but honesty and kindness are the same, even though they sometimes seem to be in conflict with each other. And flattery and criticism are the same, even though they look opposite. So let's see. I already talked about being an expression. This is too philosophical. I need to go on. Humility, self-worth, shame, egotism. Maybe you need different words here, so don't get caught up in the terminology. But humility and shame look a lot the same. And yet shame is something that keeps us trapped, and humility is something that allows us to grow and move forward. Self-worth. You were mentioning how important it is to feel like I'm worth loving, and how easy it is to confuse that with egotism. I'm better than everybody else, or especially better than you, So, and self-worth is not genuine without humility. You've got to have those two together. If you don't have humility, your self-worth is just egotism. And if you don't have self-worth, your humility is just shame, because you're not recognizing the gifts that the Lord has given you. And so you get trapped in shame. So, I'm over time. So, I want to thank you there's lots more of these. And these paraboxes extend, well, the writings say, if you take everything in the universe and sum it up, it's all a matter of love and wisdom, or goodness and truth. And that's what these paraboxes are about. So they're about everything in the universe. And we can apply it in a lot of different areas. And I'd be happy to show some of those to you at another time. And thank you.